So I like found like the pages are like,
You're passing me that camera. Actually, so just need to set it back up.
All right. Really does. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, but you can promise me go to work buses late and traffic is rush hour on it's about 35. But at the end of the day, we're going out. Look out the window behind the flag. Yeah. Yeah, I can't wait for that. I'll use the shuttle. Stop to buy the phone. Yeah. Can't drive. That's the thing. I think we saw yeah, so, and so, yeah, when everything lines up correctly, we get but like maybe once a week. And then other times when we just want to do it, it'll take me an hour to get 3 miles. To move 3 miles. Yeah. I don't understand how it works because it's the M line. Well, how is it not a train? How is it not a train? Where did it go? Yeah, really appreciate your reporting. The Cape Town? Oh, Detroit.
Hi, everybody. Hi, everyone. There's my shot.
Okay, I see. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Shalyn, and I'm so excited to have you all here today. Thank you for joining us. We are here for the hybrid book launch of the Bible Underclass by Dr. Stephen Thrasher. We wanted just to start off today with a land acknowledgement. As we are engaged in conversation today, we would like to acknowledge the longstanding history that has brought us to reside on this land and allowed us to join in community today. The bookstore stands on the land of Peria, nervous, Potawatomi, and Miami people live in. Our quote today in acknowledging the land we stand on reflects on the many ways power and privilege intersect in our lives in the ongoing and very real reality of colonialism. We encourage you to learn and reflect about land, indigeneity, and colonialism. We also encourage everyone to support Native-led organizations in your community. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Join us for more events so that we can keep doing this. You can learn more on our website. You can learn more on our website, yes, and also ask us as your booksellers. We also would like to pass the can. This is one of our very first in-person events in 2 years. Woohoo! Back in the day, we used to pass the hat at an event to collect donations for our Women's Voices Fund, the nonprofit arm of our bookstore that makes these events and programming possible. As you can imagine, after 2 years, that fund is almost dry. So by passing the can today, we hope that you'll toss $1 or 20 in to help us get our events and programming running and back up. I'm gonna pass it, no pressure, but we would love if you can to support. Not that. That's so real. I can't see my colleague, so we'll ask at the end and I'll let you know. But some brief remarks about the book. The viral underclass is told through the heart-rendering stories of friends, activists, and teachers navigating the novel coronavirus, HIV, and other viruses. Dr. Thrasher brings the reader with him as he delves into the viral underclass and lays bare its inner working. The viral underclass helps us understand the world more deeply by showing the fraught relationship between privilege and survival. Dr. Stephen Thrasher holds the inaugural Daniel H. Brenberg Chair at Northwestern's McGill School, the first journalism professorship in the world created to focus on LGBT research. He is also a faculty member of Northwestern's Institute of Sexual and Gender Minority Health and Wellbeing. As a columnist, oh my goodness, for Scientific American, his writing has been widely published by the New York Times, Nation, The Atlantic, Journal of American History, BuzzFeed News, Esquire, and New York. The viral underclass is his first book and hopefully not his last.
We'll see.
Dr. Thrasher is joined today with Natalie Moore, who has been broadcast on the BBC, Marketplace, and NPR's Morning Edition, All Things Considered, and Weekend Edition. Natalie is the author of The South Side, A Portrait of Chicago and American Segregation, winner of the 2016 Chicago Review of Books Award for Nonfiction and the BuzzFeed Best Nonfiction Book of 2016. We're so excited to have you both here with us today, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Thrasher and Natalie Moore.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much to this wonderful bookstore that's been doing fantastic work since 1979. I really appreciate getting to be here and your commitment to having a vaccination and mask policy that lets us be here as safely as possible. It's really beautiful to have that, as well as to have people be able to join us from the safety of their homes as well. So thank you so much. A couple other thank yous I want to say. I'm so touched to be here with Natalie Moore, who's been somebody that I've looked up to for many years, and is the only person that I will fight for Golden Girls trivia queen status, but she might beat me there. Many people in this room, I just want to say thank you to Zach Siegel, who's here somewhere. Thank you for reading a chapter of the book, and check out his cover story and Harper's right now. That's out on newsstands. Adam Rhodes, my former TA and research wonderful person, thank you so much for helping out with this book. And particularly, I want to thank Sarah Schulman, who has been my dear friend and one of my most trusted mentors for many years. There would be no book without you. I don't know whether to be angry at you about that or happy about that, but I love you a great deal. And check out one of her 19 books. I'm sure many of them are here, including the most recent one, Let the Record Show, History of ACT UP, 1987 to 1993, right, yours? So I just wanted to, I'm just going to read for about 5 minutes, and then we'll get into the conversation. And I'm going to read, I read different things everywhere that I've been going. I'm reading actually from the last chapter of the book, which is pretty depressing, although it's followed by an epilogue that's not as depressing. So check out the book if you want to hear something that's not as depressing. But I wanted to read this because this is about one of the major people I write in the book, a Greek activist named Zach Christopoulos, who is HIV positive and also a queer man. And the reason I ended up writing about Zach was because I write about this in the book, I got a fellowship to study while I was finishing my dissertation in Greece. And it was at NYU Center. My project had nothing to do with Greece, but I just got to go there to write for 3 months and hopefully not think about police violence and racism and homophobia. But within about a week of my being there, a young person was killed by a mob, kicked to death by 8 people, which included 4 police officers. And it turned out he was the most prominent HIV positive activist in the country. So I'm just going to read about the last, I'll read about a moment where I encountered him when I wasn't expecting to while I was writing. As I finished writing this book, I accidentally stumbled upon a video that Zach Christopoulos had made many years before in 2013. By the time I saw it, I had seen a nonverbal short film starring Zach called You for Undetectable Equals Untransmittable, a lot of videos of Zachy O lip syncing to pop songs like Sweet Transvestite from the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and of Zach speaking in Greek, which I don't understand at all. Yet I've never really heard his voice in a way that I could fully comprehend. This YouTube video was different, for Zach was speaking in his first language from his childhood in the United States, American English. In years of trying to know him, I had no idea such a video had existed. Hi there, my name is Zach Christopoulos, and I'm sending you this message from Greece, he said, looking directly into the camera. Addressing people who are newly diagnosed with HIV, Zach smiles gently in the video. Unlike in the film or in his book, Society Doesn't Fit Me, but My Little Black Dress Does, Zach seems lighthearted and open about his viral status. He tells people he's been living with HIV for some time, and it's been quite a journey, but not an unpleasant one all the way. Calmly, he speaks to people who may have just been diagnosed with HIV as well. And while he is sympathetic that it's new information that can be frightening and might feel overwhelming at first, he wants these kinfolk to know that they can handle it and can live a full and happy life living with HIV, as long as you don't let it get the best of you and don't give up. Friends can offer support because no one should go through it alone. Also, he said, I know being diagnosed with HIV comes with a lot of stigma and discrimination and stereotypes you'll have to face, he continues. But it's nothing to be ashamed about, and no matter what anybody says, the fact that you have HIV does not make you unworthy or dirty or anything like that. It just makes you human, he says, succinctly conveying in just 5 words a sentiment I wish every human could believe about themselves and about every other human affected by every virus. We each need relationships with each other to understand who we are. There is nothing like looking into the face of another human or tracing it with your fingers to understand who you are as a person. And maybe that is the most valuable aspect of humankind's relationship with viruses. They remind us that in our breathing, and in our kissing, and in our hugging, and in our dancing, and in our fucking, we are human. These are the things that make us human. I pray my friend Olivier knew this at the end of his life. We will never eradicate all viruses. There are more of them on our planet than there are stars in the universe. But if we accept our vulnerable humanity, and if we learn as a species to live in relationship with viruses, we will not need to let their harshest consequences pool within a viral underclass. Indeed, if we learn what it meant to cohabitate with them responsibly, viruses could teach us to create a world without class or other hierarchies. In his YouTube message, Zach assures the newly diagnosed that they will indeed find people who will love and support you for who you are, because you're basically the same person. He also tells people without HIV that if they know someone who is recently diagnosed with the virus, there's no need to change the way you act around them. You don't have to change the way you treat them. There is nothing to be afraid of. The video is so gentle, so human. Unlike his howls in his own writing, and his primal prancing in his drag sets, here, Zach gently calls people in. So basically, I think that's about it. Just don't give up, keep on smiling, fight the stigma, fight the stereotypes, be yourself, and love. His eyebrows raised in a smile. When those men kicked Zach to death, flaying him alive on a carpet of broken glass, they not only stole his life from him and from the people who loved him. They removed this guardian who was stood ready to welcome any immigrant newly arrived in Athens. And they kept any newly diagnosed member of the viral underclass who could have found him online from connecting with him in real life. Watching him on video, I wondered, how can the loss of such an immeasurable gift be measured? That's all he says, kissing the air. Thank you. Hi.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
It's beautiful. What I really appreciated about this book is, I mean, your scholarship forces us to think bigger and gives us a framework and language for inequities that we see. You know, we know about housing discrimination, we know about healthcare disparities, and you know, just pick any measure in this country, but virus, I don't think that, I mean, pre-COVID, that we didn't think about it in these terms. Maybe it was abstract, but how it creates the viral underclass. Yeah, I just think it's required reading and understanding. I want to get into some definitions, but first, if there's a through line through this book, to me, it's Michael Johnson. Can you tell everyone who he is and your journalism around him?
Sure. So did I lose this? There we go. So Michael Johnson is not such a young man anymore. Well, I mean, he's 30, that's not so old. But it's been almost 10 years that I've been writing about him. And I met him when he was just 22 and was arrested and accused of transmitting HIV to 2 people and exposing it to 4 others. And he began this almost Kafka-like journey of being prosecuted for transmitting this virus in a way that you couldn't even trace that had happened between these people. And for people in the audience who are unfamiliar with it, you can be prosecuted for a variety of ways of transmitting pathogens to other people. HIV is the one that's most known. It's happened with COVID and various jurisdictions around the world in different ways. Illinois, we should be really proud of, is actually one of just 2 states that is decriminalized entirely, which is good because what we want when people are infected with an infectious virus, something that can be transmitted, we want them to feel safe and able to come forward. So Michael was arrested in 2013. One of the screen names he used was Tiger Mandingo. And that is the reason why he even knew who he was, because there were these stories around the world, as one of my editors pushed me to include, and it's in the final book as well. There were stories about him in Australia, which sort of gives the scale of how HIV becomes personified, as if this virus that 35, 40 million people around the world live with was somehow coming from this young man. And so he was facing time in prison. He refused to take a plea deal. He has always maintained that he told his partners what his status was, and therefore he shouldn't be prosecuted. But he initially was found guilty and sentenced to 30 years in prison. And then after about a year, through using my reporting, a number of his supporters were able to get legal help for him and mounted an appeal. And eventually it was overturned, and he got out of prison after about 6 years after all the legal wrangling happened. And now he's living in Indiana. His parole should be over from the plea deal that he entered into to keep so he didn't get prosecuted again. Should be over in a couple months. He's living well, but I found in his story so many of the disasters of Black America that are blamed on people that aren't really their fault. He did not read well, even though he was this college athlete that had almost finished college. The university was very happy to use his body until they found out he had HIV.
He was a college wrestler.
He was a college wrestler. And then pretty much everyone in his life abandoned him when they found out he had HIV. And that's unfortunately a very common story, even though this virus is relatively easy to deal with when people can get the medication that works quite well. But he was basically banded by everyone that he knew at the time, and then has been extremely well supported by people who do justice work around HIV, that they've supported him. So he's living quite well, and he's been extremely generous with me and allowing me to tell a bit of his story. But it was because of him and seeing that all the anxieties around HIV fell on his head, and that he was basically being held responsible for engaging in unprotected sex, which anytime any one of us does, pregnancy can happen, disease transmission can happen, but he was really being held responsible criminally for this, for a lot of anxiety, and could have spent his entire life in prison. And I'm really grateful that they got out, even though it was 6 years.
As I was reading about his case throughout the chapters, it made me think about Jack McCoy in Law and Order, because I'm pretty sure there was an episode where he was prosecuting people who, he was prosecuting someone who had HIV and had spread it. We know so much more about disease than we did in the past, but how did these criminalizations get on the books? And do you know how many states still, did you say Illinois is only one of 2 states?
Illinois is one of 2 states that have completely criminalized. Some states never criminalized in the first place, but I think there were 35, 36 that had it at one point, and 5 or 6 have reduced them, or maybe it's more now. California just reduced theirs, but Illinois and obviously Texas are the 2 states that have completely decriminalized it. So, and where I did most of my work on the story in St. Louis in Missouri, that state, they rolled it back a lot. They didn't do it entirely, but they rolled back the HIV laws a lot with a Republican governor, Republican legislator. So I always think, like, don't set your sights too low if you're trying to do work in these states. If Texas can do it and Illinois, the span of states, some fall somewhere in between those 2.
Can you give us a little glimpse of how the prosecutor went after Michael Johnson and some of the arguments and language that he used?
Yeah, so the prosecutor, Philip Greenway, it was funny, a writer I've actually met once now, but we had not met in person, just DM'd me about how much he disliked this prosecutor. He was like, how does he know this person's name? And I realized, oh yeah, he's reading my book. But the prosecutor, his name was Philip Greenway, and he was like, I've never seen Law and Order actually, but he seems like sort of a workahorse Law and Order prosecutor. He was not the elected DA, but he had like a very formidable record. And he went after this with everything he had. And it was really stark seeing the difference between the public defender, who a couple of times had someone bring her a paper, but otherwise was completely by herself. And then the prosecutor had like 8 people with him at all times. And clearly they were putting enormous resources into this case. And so he began the trial actually by turning his ire at me, because I'd already written a story about him. Even though we never met, he refused to let me interview him. But he recognized who I was, and he tried to have the judge throw me out of the courtroom because he thought that I would be biased and try to sway the jury. And he said, some of these journalists are really activists. And throughout the rest of the trial, like the bailiff would just stare at me. I mean, I've been out of this court for years. Eventually I sued him because he wouldn't give me papers that I needed. Although he did finally grant me an interview. But he really like went after Michael with everything he had. And he says multiple things that one might think couldn't be said in court. He's quoting the Bible constantly and using it as a frame of reference. He's talking about how HIV criminalization is worse than murder, that murder stops with a gun and a bullet, but with HIV, it's going to kill you and you and you, and then it's going to kill the next person, the next person. He very bluntly said on the sentencing stage that this was not being done for gay people. He threw his own witnesses under the bus at the end, but it was there to protect the straight people who might encounter gay people at some point. Everything he did was legal. He didn't do well, except one thing, which is part of how we got the conviction overturned. He failed to disclose discovery, which is a major violation of prosecutorial ethics. And I found it very ironic that the whole case was about Michael not disclosing his HIV status, and eventually it got thrown out because he did not disclose it. He had 24 hours of recordings from the jail.
The irony.
Oh, the irony. Other than that, everything he did in the courtroom itself was legal. And the last thing I'll say about him that is kind of the basis of, I think, chapter 6 or 7, is that he's really efficient at keeping the scientific understanding of HIV out of the courtroom. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot, as the CDC has said, we only have to have a 5-day moratorium, and as various jurisdictions are not allowing, either not requiring masks or not allowing masks, is that the law has this really strong role in the understanding of science. And Greenway kept it that this Missouri law, written in the 1980s, was the way that people in that community and the state of Missouri understood HIV. They treated HIV as a death sentence. The law was written at a time where if you became HIV positive, you would probably die after a certain number of years. And anytime anyone tried to bring in that wasn't the case, that it's very easy to deal with now, he like consistently kept that out of the record. very legally. And that made the jury think, and everyone reading the verdict think, that HIV was still a death sentence.
There are three terms that I would like for us to, would like for you to talk about. The book title, Viral Underclass, Ground Zero, and Prophylaxis. So let's start with where the term viral underclass comes from.
The term originally comes from an activist named Sean Strube, who used it to talk about HIV criminalization. And for anyone who's run any kind of critical race theory or understood the ways that racism itself, how the law itself produces racism, that's kind of a way to understand what Sean was saying about a viral underclass, and that people living with the virus of HIV live under a different set of laws. And there are times in US history where law about race explicitly says that it's about race, that two races can't marry or something like that. But for the most part in US history, laws that are racist don't explicitly say this applies to this race. The outcome itself is what is racist. With the HIV laws, they're very explicit about it. You're HIV positive, all of these things for the rest of your life, you can be prosecuted for, you're living under a different law. And Sean, I think, illustrated that best in talking about the case of infants who are born with HIV and who seroconvert during pregnancy. For the rest of their life, they're going to live under this different set of laws. I encountered it hearing actually Black activists using it in a very different or very explicit way. When I was working on this case, I went to a conference about HIV criminalization. I heard these activists basically saying that they wanted what Illinois did eventually, to have a repeal of these laws and say HIV cannot be criminalized, everything about it is racist, nothing about it helps the public health, it should be gone. And then there's another set of activists that's been doing something that's happened in more states where they've said, well, we can at least update the laws, update the science, say that if you are taking HIV medication, then you are what's considered undetectable and can't transmit the virus. And if that's the case, then you should not be prosecuted. And they want to reform the laws. And there's this fight between abolition and reform, as we have seen happen in the DLM and prison and cops and all other places. And so they were saying that creates the viral underclass, that these people who can't get HIV medication, those are the people who are a viral underclass. And so when I was writing a book project and COVID happened, and I didn't know if I was going to lose my job at Northwestern. I just started a few months before. I didn't know my agent didn't know, like, are people going to still be buying books? But my agent, Tanya McKinnon, who I owe a great deal to, said, I think people are going to watch everything they can watch on Netflix, and then they're going to be reading books in this pandemic. And she was right. Book sales went up a great deal. And she really had vision, even though it was like very hard for me to see this. And she has to look at my dissertation again and saw that I had ended it with the scene about these activists using the phrase viral underclass. She said, that's the analytic to use. And so that's what I tried to do, is use that as a way to kind of understand what's happening now at this moment. In March, April, May, when I was putting the book together, I didn't know it was going to happen. I often read from chapter 9 of the book, where I write about how one of my mentor editors died of COVID, and I ended up being one of the people who settled for his estate and took care of his affairs because he didn't have much family. So I had no idea what was going to happen, but I tried to use this idea of a viral underclass to be an analytic, to think about what's happening and to see the ways that things are getting made throughout this process. And we see it repetitively with COVID. I think the most damaging one, the most immediate one we're seeing right now is that the Democrats failed to pass a spending bill for COVID relief, and they made it so that people without insurance can no longer get tested or treated. That hasn't been paid for months now. Even as the evidence shows that the workers who are essential to what we actually need to live are unlikely to get insurance and have insurance and to be exposed to COVID the most and to die of it most often. They're the ones who need it the most. And so we see the ways that a viral underclass is being produced. And we see it in these anti-gay and anti-trans laws around the country when trans young people, when all LGBT young people are not allowed to understand their bodies, the state is effectively opening up a pathway into their bodies and into their veins and allowing these viruses to move there. And especially when we're saying to trans children and trans adults that they can't get the medication they need, and we push them into the contraband market, that's almost guaranteed recipe for more hepatitis and HIV and other things. So that's sort of that phrase.
And there are so many parallels with HIV and COVID. And one of those similarities is using the term ground zero.
Thank you. That, to me, that was one of the most interesting things for me to write. There's been good research and scholarship for a while about the role of the concept of a patient zero and how it's the very short version of it. It's used often to talk about the first person imagined to come into a space with a virus, but it's based on a mistake by journalist Randy Schultz. It was,
And he wrote in the band.
and the band played on.
The things.
Yeah, and he identified Kate Dugas as this patient zero, and it's really unfair because Dugas was very helpful with contact tracers and trying to help them understand what was happening, and was one of 40 people one investigator was talking to. He was the only one outside of California, which that investigator was working on. And so he just labeled him patient letter O. It wasn't even numeric zero. It was completely a mistake. But the way
And he was a flight attendant in Canada, and this was the 1970s.
well, this was the 1980s, but yeah.
Okay.
But he had been active since the 1970s. And so I would hear this phrase patient zero a lot. And I also thought that numerically, not just numerically, but linguistically, it was tracking onto ground zero, and how often that we have heard, and sometimes I was literally hearing journalists use the phrase ground zero. Corona Queens was ground zero, or describing a neighborhood in a city as the ground zero of COVID. And linguistically, I thought that is really stigmatizing because ground zero goes back to an atom bomb going off originally. It's the space on the earth right above where an atom bomb is dropped in New Mexico or in Japan. Hopefully those are the two big places where it's happened before, and some spots in the Pacific Ocean. And then eventually it was also used to describe the falling of the Trade Center as a ground zero. And so I thought when we describe somebody as a patient zero or talk about the ground zero of COVID, it's making that person sound like they're an atomic bomb waiting to go off, which is the last thing we want to say to somebody who is experiencing something difficult and it's not their fault. They need to be treated with compassion and not with blame.
And again, the research shows that there's just really no way to figure out who is patient zero in any of these cases.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to find it out. In Michael Johnson's case, you can identify that the same strain is in people, but you can't say where it came from, like what direction it came from. And often you can't do that either because it's moving. And to an extent, I understand this is a finite difference between public health people and journalists. I understand the impetus to sort of know where the virus came from and sort of to understand its trajectory. But it's almost always a fantasy to think that's the first and only one. And the US will imagine itself as having nothing in it. We now have there's a new variant of concern. Well, it hasn't been declared that yet, but it will be called that soon. And the US will just sort of pretend like it couldn't possibly be here, it's somewhere else, even when we have more coronavirus circulating than any other country on Earth. And so like the first time that it's identified, they'll say like, that's that person. And journalists are particularly, unfortunately, bad about this. So yeah, viruses, the metaphor I've come to think of, it doesn't work with avian flu, but it works with every other pathogen. And viruses don't arrive at you like a stork, just like a baby. Like the story that told children that storks cause babies, they don't. Babies come from sex and contact between people, and so do viruses. Viruses are always socially experienced. So the idea that it just like magically appears in that person is not true. It's always moving between at least two human beings or between a non-human animal and human. So it's very difficult to say who it is. I do understand why public health people are trying to understand the general movement, but journalists should never be personifying that one person.
And prophylaxis, not just condoms.
Not just condoms. This was,
I just love that as a metaphor to, well, I'll let you explain your own metaphor.
Thank you. Well, my editors pushed me on to explain it better, and so did Greg Gonzalez from ACT UP. So prophylaxis as a language word just means protection. And we've come to use it to talk about prophylactics, sometimes as a synonym for condoms, but it can be any kind of barrier that's protecting people. So our masks are prophylaxis and condoms are prophylaxis in sort of a physical way, face shields, personal protective gear, the air circulating, if it's being done well, can also, a HEPA filter can be it. But then I also think that there are these kind of more conceptual forms that are equally powerful. So education is a very powerful one. If people do or do not know how to use condoms, or do not understand the ways that STIs move, that is a really big barrier. And then freedom from incarceration is one. We sort of know the societal things that are guaranteed to make pathogens move. Being arrested, being in the prison is itself something that's very dangerous. So not being arrested is a form of prophylaxis. Having a house is a very big form of prophylaxis. Having health insurance and knowing that you're going to see a doctor. And so something I've learned a lot from a group I write about very briefly in the book called What Would an HIV Doula Do? And they're activists and artists that encourage people to think about an HIV diagnosis the way that someone is having a baby, and to support that person and welcome them into their new life in the same way that we support people who are having children, to make a commitment to supporting this person in their new life and saying this is not theirs to deal with alone. And they were also really good in helping me understand the ways that we can't just focus obsessively on moments of viral transmission. There are many steps before and many steps after. And so one, like a very immediately close form of prophylaxis would be a condom potentially, or not. But then education, housing, these are also forms that are going to sort of direct viral risk one way or the other.
You write about so many people in the book, and these stories help carry your research. We've already heard about Zach, we've heard about Michael. If I can play favorites, mine would be Lorena Flores, and someone who left a lot of these prophylaxis that you're talking about. Can you tell us about her?
Lorena was the first person in my outer social circle to die of COVID. She died on, I believe, March 30th of 2020. And I had met her once as a reporter reporting on the story, but I knew many people were close to her, including my good friend, the translator Chase Stringio. And Lorena was just a legend in the trans Latinx community in Queens. She did formal and informal work that really protected people, and she did do work where she would help people get into healthcare. But she also would just stand out on the street night after night and hand out condoms, hand out sterile syringes, hand out food to people, and also tried to help people know that they were loved. And she had traveled from Mexico herself as a child, or as a young person. She had been trafficked. She was misgendered as a child, wanted to come to the United States to live as a woman, came to the US, but was trafficked, ended up HIV positive, and addicted to drugs, and was able to become sober and tried to help other people find sobriety if that's what they wanted, and was just this force of a person. The two things that stood out to me most in learning more about her was that she was doing bail fund work before it was kind of broadly known or even had a name for the last 20 years. And what she would do was find out that a trans person had been arrested and go to court, crowdsource money to post for their bail, but also just to go to the sentencing, even if she didn't know the person directly, and go say, Your Honor, when the judge would ask, is there anyone here in your community? And oftentimes the people didn't have formal family. And she said, Your Honor, we're here, we're her family, we're going to take care of her. And she did this with at least 50 people to get them out of jail. She was also known for this bag that she carried out. Everyone I interviewed about her would talk about her Mary Poppins bag with her cart. And she would just show up in the ACLU office and tell the people, you're going to help this person, whether or not they wanted to.
And what would be in her cart?
Well, okay, I mean, on the street, she would have syringes and food. But one of the funniest stories was she showed up in this lawyer who was kind of like, well, I will help one person in this case, but I can't help the other. I don't have her original birth certificate. And she'd be like, here's a birth certificate. That's work. And so, and like people would say they couldn't find something, she'd come back hours later and have like, here are the birth certificates, here's the arrest records. Even though she, as I write about the book, she felt very self-conscious about her English, which was not, she was able to operate pretty effectively in English, but she felt very self-conscious about it. And yet she was able to just do these amazing things and find the resources and go and get stuff for people. And it was really revealing for me it was the first Zoom funeral I went to that Chase organized that night. And where she lived and where she died was in the sort of emerging map of the first COVID deaths that I was seeing, was mapping pretty clearly onto existing maps around racial violence, maps of people that are incarcerated and HIV, and also cases of HIV that advanced to AIDS. So in a way, I wasn't surprised to learn that she had also been living with HIV for many years, because she had the kind of body that was treated as an immigrant and as a trans person in ways that took away prophylaxis and did not allow her to get protection.
There are two things that we're not going to be able to get to, but I just want to throw it out there to you all. I have one last question before we turn it over to you all for questions, and that's it's such an indictment on capitalism as a virus, and also the myth of white immunity to all of this. So just keep those in mind and buy the book and read it. But well, during the reading, then when I finished and I was sitting with it, Gwendolyn Brooks came to mind a lot, and her poem, "We Are Each Other's Harvest, We Are Each Other's Business," because ultimately your book is about mutual aid and agape love, and not thinking about ourselves as individuals if we have a virus or if someone else does. But if we put all these, if we take down barriers and have prophylaxis in society, then we won't have the damage of these viruses. But toward the end of the book, because of the space I'm in, my eyes perked when I read about abortion. And I've been thinking about this too, the language. I think I was also thinking about when you know better, you do better. Like people, not that it's an excuse, but in the 80s, why were these laws put on the books? Because people didn't know. And I think about the language of abortion and probably how it was wrong to use privacy as a defense, or wrong to use privacy as the hook for Roe v. Wade, and the language around my body, my choice, because you have anti-maskers saying my body, my choice, and you have people who are, for abortion rights saying my body, my choice. And well, I have why did you put that in, and what point were you trying to make with that?
So yeah, it's a little bit of a spoiler. This is kind of where the book ends. Although, well, yeah, I'm describing it. Yeah. This is right after that moment. So to me, this felt like one of the most difficult intellectual things to deal with in the book, and to me, one of the most controversial. And this is something I've been thinking about since I was in graduate school, that the idea that framing abortion as a matter of choice goes into certainly a liberal logic. But also, I think, and this I've been thinking about more since the book came out, because the book came out before monkeypox and before the Dobbs decision, that I think it was a mistake to sort of deal with abortion as something that was so shameful couldn't be spoken about. So I think that was a mistake. But also this idea that it's just my body and my choice. And the reason why we can have our masks off while we're talking relatively safely right now is because all of us have had our masks on, and all of you still have your masks on. And so we, like, collectively as a group, brought down whatever potential viral load is in this room. And that's the kind of thinking that I think we really need to have. I'm going to work my way back to abortion. But I first wanted to say I've been engaged in a lot of conversations this week about the ongoing death rate with COVID. And it was about 4,000 last week. The height of AIDS in the United States, it was about 1,000. So I don't know why we're not taking it very seriously. And some of the pushback I've been getting, both sort of at the level of trolls, but also you see this coming from people near the administration, is that it's mostly elderly people and disabled people, which of course is ableist and eugenic. And even if we think about, well, if whatever percent of people are over a certain age, again, like the virus is not sort of swooping in on a stork and giving it to them. They're getting it through us. And this is a problem through all of us. Like we all share a communal body through which these viruses move, and they change our genetic code between us. And they really demystify the idea of the American individual. Like we all need one another and share space and sometimes blood and semen or drugs, but certainly air with one another. And so I think that I am choosing to think more about how, if we all share this body, how do we take care of this body? And that means it can't just be you do you and I do me. With monkeypox, I think it's actually been a pretty successful effort that we've seen this summer from the gay community of people volunteering to run clinics and getting monkeypox shots to each other, but also a lot of people, myself included, having a lot less sex or no sex for 4 months. Because I think the gay community since AIDS have had a very good understanding that this is something to share, and it's not just about one person's risk or another. We're all kind of having to navigate this together. And to come back to abortion, one of the things that I have felt unsettled about is that, of course, people should be able to choose to get abortions, and that should be a choice. But I've been thinking about how so much of the effort for having an abortion is just put on one person to figure out, particularly as access is declined. But also birth itself is very much, okay, you don't want to have an abortion and you're having a child, you're now on the hook for $300,000 for the next 18 years or whatever. And so I think about what can viruses help us understand that having an abortion, having a child, having a virus, having cancer, all of these things, like the risk should not just be on one person. We should all kind of be sharing the risk and the reward from them. And so as 50 years of liberal politics collapsed under dogs around abortion, I don't think the My Body, My Choice worked by itself. And it's been very heartening. Miriam Kaba, who's a longtime Chicago activist, and lots of activists here in Chicago, I think have been doing a great job, and including your work both as a reporter and as a playwright, and Sarah's work for many decades have done a really good job of just saying abortion is nothing to be ashamed of. We're going to talk about it as a matter of health. Everyone deserves health care. I think a lot of activists have done that around monkeypox. And I think viruses just give us a roadmap for being able to negotiate these things and understand how to talk about them a little more directly.
We have time for, we have about 10 minutes for questions. Yes.
Yeah, so you said 4,000 people died of coronavirus
In the United States last week.
Are people who are vaccinated and boosted dying of coronavirus?
They are as well. I mean, you are much more likely to die if you're not vaccinated. But particularly when the numbers get so high, people who are also vaccinated are also dying. And there were times in the last 6 months where a majority of the people dying were vaccinated. That's not to say vaccines don't work, but when we are letting, we're at like 70, 80,000 cases a day right now. We've been at times where we've had 1 million cases a day. When you just let the numbers go that high, of course, it's going to sweep in a lot of people. And death is only one metric. What's happening with long COVID is extremely concerning. One of the lessons that I write about this a little bit in the book is we need to have a sense of humility. We only have known about this virus for 3 years, and what it's going to do long term is not clear. But so far, to come back to your question about vaccination, the variants have drifted so much from the variants have drifted so much that the vaccines are seeming to do almost nothing to stop transmission. The bivalent, which I just got, that is matching the current strain, should, fingers crossed, stop transmission. But we have a very short window with that. We're going to have new variants soon.
So what is your answer to that? I mean, do you think there should be mask mandates?
Yeah, I think that we should be masking, indoors and subways and movie theaters and classrooms and universities.
But should they be mandated?
I think they probably should be in the United States. In most countries, South Korea didn't really have mandates, but they have more buy-in. But I think that we need to have them. And like here, I really love working with this bookstore, and I'm doing all these book talks, and some places are very open to it, some are not. But it's like a lot of effort. If you don't have a mandate, it's really hard to get a critical mass of people to do it. And it's okay. This is like one of the first times I've ever taken it off while I've been talking myself in front of a group. But it's not fair to expect people who are compromised not to come to events, or for them to be the only ones to mask, or for them to have to ask people. Like, I find it very, very. It takes a lot of energy and effort to get people to do it. And I did 2 events at Cornell last week. I had a mask mandate for my event. Everyone wore masks. Then I went to another event. There was no mask mandate. The same people didn't wear masks, or many of the same people didn't wear masks. And so it's just much easier to deal with at the institutional level. But it's becoming nearly impossible because the president said there's no more pandemic. I think that makes it very tough. Speaker.
Not a question, just a comment, but dealing with mask mandates, the easiest way around that is reminding people that defaults are mandated, and if we have taken that away, like what do people happen? So mandates work for good public health measures like masking and seatbelts and other things and so on. Don't smoke 15 feet from public spaces, etc. Yeah.
Yes.
Can you talk about the sort of pivot into the individual, something I'm kind of fascinated by, in terms of public health messaging, especially from the White House? I think that there's some, I'm going to say this is the governor of New York used the term individual public health, which is a very well-known.
I haven't heard that from Governor Hochul, but
Yeah. And I'll talk about how
she also
that-
said, yeah, she's spending all this money on cameras on subways, and she said we want to be Big Brother. And I took the CTA here. There have been cameras on the CTA for a long time. I'm not sure that stops violence.
But yeah, the sort of broader idea how we kind of slowly pivoted into this idea of individualized public health, which obviously the public health experts feel like they're losing it because of the confusion. Talk about how we put the burden on individuals, which obviously many disability activists have claimed is basically just blowing smoke up. Talk about that.
Yeah. So the patient zero trope that I write about in the book is a way to personify sickness as something that's an irresponsible person doing. And I do a breakdown of a story that I still can't believe is on ABC News website, where we're talking about COVID parties and how young people are explicitly giving COVID to one another. They're gambling on it. You come to the thing and then they take it to, this is when there were no tests, by the way. But young people come and then they all bet on who's going to get it, and then they all take a test afterwards, and the money, none of this ever happened. And it's pretty proven that there's no evidence of it. But the concept is very useful to always say, like, it's a sloppy person who is doing this. And so part of the move with moving the vaccines into the quote commercial market away from a public health model is to create the idea that, yeah, now it's up to you to get vaccinated. And if you don't have insurance or too poor, it's your fault. That's a bad thing that you let this happen to you. The White House, the governor of New York is approved to take masks off the subways. And so one of the signs says, "You do you now," on the subway, which is, again, really moving things onto the individual. And it's really disturbing because we know systemically how this is going to play out. In 1996, HIV medication came into the world that could save lives. It took 7 years to get to some countries from that time. Within the United States, the racial disparities around it actually grew because the people who had access to insurance and could get the medication got it, and their lives were saved, and their social networks, the virus went down amongst them. And so now people who go see a doctor once a year will get a COVID vaccine. Wrench in their plan could be that this thing could mutate more than once a year. But in theory, people who are going to get a COVID vaccine once a year are going to fare much better than people who don't. Already happens with flu. People get flu vaccines, and their social networks fare much better than those don't. And the results are predictably racialized. But the idea that it's an individual who has to go do this thing is helpful because it takes the responsibility off the state. I feel like President Biden is basically saying this collective problem that we all share the risk on is really a new problem. And a really clear illustration of how we can see this is that we were very successful in getting the elderly in this country vaccinated. I think 98% over a certain age were vaccinated at some point. That took tremendous effort going to nursing homes and an infrastructure to do so. And that disappeared. Like very few people relatively compared to that have become boosted. It's not because they became anti-vaxxers, it's that the infrastructure delivered to them went away. And the excuse for the infrastructure going away is narrated as a problem of people being individually irresponsible. But we can't have 330 million people individually negotiating this thing that involves all of our bodies. Do we have time for one more?
Yeah, we do.
First, yes, love the book. And I want to maybe just have you elaborate more about the title, and the term underclass is so haunting in its own way. And so I write a lot about drugs. And the first time I heard the term underclass was in a Charles Krauthammer 1989 Washington Post column, where this is like the quote unquote crack baby thing. And he says that there's a whole new bio underclass being like standard for, and now this is like adding the word bio in front of it really tags it as like, I guess, essential and permanent. Like, can you talk about, I guess, the viral underclass and like to what extent, like its contours and like how it can be shed, or like how people can like, transcend this class?
Well, does anyone here know Celeste Watkins Hayes? Do you know her? Yeah. So Celeste, when she read it or the intro, she's like, you have to like go into the underclass wars. So I wrote like a page about the underclass wars, and my editor was like, no, that has to come out. And I didn't fight very hard about that, except to say that I do say in the introduction, I'm using the term underclass in a way to describe class, and it's not a judgment on people's character. And for me, one of the things I hope this book does for especially for those who haven't really thought this way before, is to have an understanding how viruses can give us a class analysis. So I don't mean, underclass in any derogatory way whatsoever. And there is this history with Krauthammer and also with Charles Murray, and understanding kind of how underclass is perceived in the United States. What I really mean by it, I don't know that people can individually escape it. And I think that that's like one of the big American myths, is that it's up to you to move from the lower class to the upper class. I think this is a phenomenon that is produced by capitalism. This virus helps us understand that, but the system of capitalism itself guarantees that it's going to happen. And the virus itself both sort of illustrates how it happens, but it also particularly shows how viruses themselves become a way that people fall down the economic ladder. For instance, with monkeypox this summer, I kept seeing these crowdfunding things where a bartender or waiter had gotten a monkeypox diagnosis, and they're mandated by the state to stay home for a month with no support, with no way. How do you pay your rent with a month of losing your wages? And in the United States, becoming infected with anything or becoming sick of anything is the key to poverty. So I think that viruses and sickness just show us how this process happens, but they also do give us a framework for understanding our fates are connected to each other, and everything we do is interdependent with one another, and therefore the risk should be interdependent. It should not be sort of just put on the person who has the misfortune to have the virus living inside of them. But you're the first non-professional sociologist who's asking me about this, so maybe in the afterward in the paperback edition, I might address it.
Well, it's always just great to use like the conservative terms.
Yes.
And like convert them, or actually like put them to use, because like the word underclass, it is kind of like just writing those tropes, but like you can reappropriate it.
That's interesting. I mean, I learned it both from HIV activists and then sort of like from leftist professors.
Yeah.
So I did not associate it with the right way.
I didn't either.
Yeah.
One of the other takeaways I thought from the book was, you feature the really truly marginalized in this. There are layers of discrimination, but when you get the race and class together, and then you're queer on top of that, just the options and the limitations and the people you highlighted, I think just show that. So definitely. Well, I'm sure you're going to stick around and sign books.
I will. Thank you so much for being here. Thank everyone for being here. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much, both of you. We're going to do our book signing just right up front. If you could be so helpful and just hold up your chair, lean it against the surface, it'd be great. Thank you all. I know where you are. Yes.